Hello, everyone. Welcome to the sneak peek and AMA for the Rhythms of Productivity, my upcoming book here. I have a few folks live with me in the Zoom session, and I believe if I've clicked the right button, we are now streaming live on YouTube as well. It says end stream now rather than go live, so I think that's a good sign. I have a few things that I'd like to talk through for the first half or so of the session, and then I have the AMA following that. Anything that you'd like to ask? Additionally, I have a few questions that have been sent me in advance, and so I know a few that I can dive into if I need to do that. So let me quickly and first share my screen over so I can kind of talk you through some of the early parts here of the content of the rhythms of productivity. So, and apologies if you see me looking off to the right a little bit here. That's where my screen is. It has these notes on it. So that's what I'm doing. First of all, the rhythms of productivity, that name, where does that come from? And the book's name reflects two things. It reflects first my background in music, which informs many of the analogies that I choose in the text that clarify some of the productivity points. And also, the rhythms of productivity is a metaphor for the many layers of interaction in our productivity systems when they're functioning as they are supposed to function. Because we do all kinds of different work. That work requires different engagement, different times, different energy levels or enemy levels, which is terrifying, but hopefully our work doesn't require much of that. And the rhythms that are implied by that engagement will determine the success or failure of our productivity approach. If everything's all landing on the same day, or we attempt to do a bunch of high energy work when our energy is low, or we do things at times that are not appropriate because they aren't lined up well with other work, we will find that the things are not going to go all that particularly well. So our goal is to get our work humming with these ideas of rhythms so that our work becomes almost effortless. The Rhythms of Productivity teaches my action-powered productivity approach, which encourages an action-first, structure follows sort of mindset. And so let me explain what I mean by action first. And let me start doing that by reading an excerpt from the introduction chapter of the Rhythms of Productivity called Composers and Conductors. This is adapted a bit, so I can kind of compress it for this venue here. Our primary problem with productivity is that we put structure first and then we cram potential action into it rather than taking action first and letting the structure follow. We allow the preordained structure of GTD or getting things done, by the way, what that means, or whatever approach we're trying. And we allow the limited opinionated feature set of tasks apps to shape the way that we work. Instead, we should take action first. Then we look at what we did. We ask, how can I do this better next time? And take the necessary steps that you will execute that action more effectively the next time you do it. The structure of the system you build will emerge from the repetition of your action. You'll use templates, automations, procedures, and more, what I call productivity bridges, to capture the recurrence and allow you to work better and faster in the future. In the Rhythms of Productivity, you will learn the fundamentals of action-powered productivity, APP. The way you work and the tools you choose to support that work need to make it easier for you to, one, take action, and two, capture recurrence. When you take action, it's simply doing what needs to be done, doing what's in front of you now. This book supplies tools to make taking action easier. When you capture recurrence, it's making sense of what you did and creating solutions for taking action more effectively next time. This book supplies you many tools to make capturing recurrence easy. That's action-powered productivity, the rhythms of productivity in a nutshell. Well, we cover a bit more than this. You need to have processes to review your work and workflows, and you'll want some guidance on thinking longer term. But if you can get action and recurrence right, most of the rest will fall into place. And so that's a little excerpt there from the introduction. And to illuminate a sense of what this action first concept means, let me explain it in terms of something else you may have heard of called Agile software development. So Agile software development has sort of been shortened into the idea of move fast and break things, but that's not really the idea of what it is. The idea is it prioritizes certain things over others. And a lot of that resonates with this action first approach idea. One of the tenets of agile software development is that individuals and interactions are prioritized over processes and tools. What I present in the rhythms of productivity is tool independent. I personally use Tana as the hub of my productivity system, but the principles that govern my approach apply in any tool. So while processes are critical, they arise from the needs of your work and your life. The action that you need to take comes first, and then you capture your processes from that. That's a challenge when we do it the other way around. We normally try to dictate what we think we ought to do rather than doing what we do and then observing how we did it and looking to do it better in the future. That's much more aligned with the idea of prototyping and improving than the idea of theoretically hoping that we know the way we need to act and then building on top of that. Second tenet of agile software development that I think resonates, working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, that doesn't mean that documentation isn't important. It is. This is what I bridge with taking action and capturing recurrence. Yes, the action is first, the quote unquote working software is first, but capturing recurrence means documenting what you did so you can leverage it in the future, the next time round, so that over time, your work gets faster, more accurate, and higher quality because of the resonance between action and recurrence. So we improve our work by documenting what we did. And then that will reflect in the way that we do the next round of work. Starts with action, working software first, but then the capturing of recurrence improves that action in the future. A third piece here, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. This one is not exactly aligned with this, but let me show how it resonates to me. It resonates with what I call use it before you trust it. It's very common when we approach our systems that we think we need to trust them before we use them, because we are afraid it won't work. We're afraid things will fall through the cracks. It's an understandable thing, and so we don't engage until we feel like we can trust it. And that looks like a catch-22, but it's not really. There is a place to start, and that's on the use side. We start with action. We start with using a system because when we do that, then we can determine what needs to be fixed. Trust follows. Trust will come as we understand what the system is, we understand how we need to build it such that we can make use out of it. Things will not work from time to time. We make them work when we discover them. The same thing is true of any system. Things don't work sometimes, whether we've built it theoretically or built it from an action forward perspective. Sometimes things won't work, but we don't know that they're not working and we can't fix them unless we're engaged with them, unless we're using them. And this one I think is really great. This last tenet of agile software, responding to change over following a plan. That doesn't mean that plans aren't important. In my chapter on creating a daily agenda, I say that don't plan to be perfect, plan to be prepared. We absolutely must plan. But the reason we plan is so that we can better adapt to the unexpected, not so that we get locked into one way of doing things. When we have a plan, we can make better decisions. We can triage as needed. We can adapt our action, but not lose sight of what else needs to be done. It reminds me very much of the idea of writing a script and getting to that stage of you have a completed outline. You know where you are. If you take that outline and in the first draft, all you do is just copy and paste it and fill in some character names, you're not going to have a very good script on the other side. That's not how you use an outline, and that's not how you use a plan. You use an outline as a framework that you can return to when you get a little lost in the writing. When you're writing the draft, you write. You know what your direction is, you know what your general idea is, but sometimes you'll discover new things as you write, which is actually something I've discovered beautifully when writing the book here too. There are so many lovely discoveries to be had in the gaps within and between concepts. And as you build those analogies and those bridges for transitions, it's exciting to sort of see that. But as you write a draft of a script, you're not just repeating the outline. The outline is the framework and the scaffolding that allows you to venture forth. And if you have to return to it to orient yourself, you can. That's the idea, and that's the idea with planning too. It's not that we don't need a plan. It's that plans facilitate our ability to adapt to change. So that's what I mean by action first. Now, the other thing I talked about was capturing recurrence, and I referenced it here in the action part too. But let me dig into it just a little bit more. Capturing recurrence is building a system without needing to overthink the whole thing. You do your work, then you figure out how to do it better next time. The system is the result. The templates, the procedures, the automations, the recurring tasks, other structures in which you capture your recurrence will become your system. Now, I call those templates, procedures, and other structures productivity bridges. That's a primary concept in the rhythms of productivity bridges. By defining that category, I make it easier to spot opportunities to capture recurrence, and by doing so, to increase the speed, the accuracy, and the quality of your work. When you don't have a productivity bridge concept as sort of the overarching vision behind templates and procedures and recurring tasks and automations and so forth, what happens is you aren't necessarily able to put a label on what you want to improve. You see a gap, you don't really know what it is, you don't know what to do about it, and so you move on. When you have a concept of, oh, there's something that's not working, I don't maybe know what the bridge is yet, but I know I'm going to need one. Let me create a task to look at this further, and I have a way to capture that now because I have a concept that makes that clearer for me. And we'll talk about that more in a moment here. But what happens for most people is they try to lay out everything they think they need first. And in so doing, they fail because that's divorced from action. Our APP approach instead, as laid out in the rhythms of productivity, is to take action more effectively by improving your note-taking, your task capture, your agenda planning, your work logging, and then capturing the action that recurs, which, by the by, is going to be almost everything. There's hardly anything you do today that you haven't done before or you aren't going to do again. And we capture that in structures like recurring tasks and templates and automations, those productivity bridges that makes your work faster, more accurate, and higher quality. Now, that's genuinely it. There isn't a lot more to the idea, minus the need to review the system to ensure it stays up to date and in sync with your work. But because even the recurrence that you capture will transform over time because there are changes in your life, there'll be changes in your work, there'll be changes in your toolkit. But if we review and we make sure that the procedures and the templates and the other bridges that we've created stay in sync with our work, then the transformation that we're capturing there will just inform the recurrence that we've captured, and we'll continue to do that work more effectively in the future. And what will happen is recurring tasks then become a primary driver of your overall system because they remind you not only to do your work, but they remind you to review aspects of your system so you can keep those areas up to date. Now, this may sound like a lot. It may sound like, okay, you've said that's just taking action, capture recurrence, but now you've layered in all these things about productivity bridges and you've layered in all these ideas about reviews and you said recurring tasks are going to show up all the time to do this stuff. I promise you it isn't really a lot. And I'm going to read you a little excerpt from the chapter on recurring tasks to illustrate the point that it isn't really that much. So this is from the chapter Recurring Tasks. When you have recurring tasks prompting you to do the right work at the right time, your system becomes a tapestry of cycles. Something happening every 4 days will only land on the same day as something happening every 13 days, once every 52 days, about 7 times a year. Once you add in all of your weekly, monthly, annual, and other tasks, you may notice that the overlapping rhythms of recurrence are dense and complex. Don't let this make you nervous. You will almost never engage with your recurring tasks from the system level perspective. The complexity of the overlapping rhythms has no impact on the complexity of your work. Why is that? Because a recurring task will only surface to your attention when it is scheduled to surface to your attention. You'll see it when you need it, not before, not after. This is a critical point for working with a productivity system. Almost all your fears are tied to thinking of the system as a whole. Thankfully, you practically never have to do that. When you capture a recurring task or anything, all that matters is the context in which it needs to surface. And when it surfaces, all that matters is that you can take action with it. The layering of these individual recurring tasks creates complexity, but you needn't engage with the complexity. The recurring tasks themselves are simple, and your interaction with them is simple. Consider comets that are visible to the naked eye from Earth. Halley's Comet, for instance, returns every 76 years. I was 6 years old on its last pass, and I'll be 82 the next time around. Here's hoping I get to see it again. The comet Hale-Bopp came through in 1997, and I'll probably not see it again, as it won't be back for approximately 2,500 years. When we mix in the orbital periods of another few dozen great comets, we'll find that while they always exist, and professional astronomers may keep tabs on them, they only become relevant when we can see them. Going outside tonight to check out Halley's Comet will do you little good unless this book does really, really well, and it's currently 2061. Our recurring tasks always exist, and the dense tapestry they weave may be impressive when viewed from the solar system level, but it's also likely to be overwhelming from that perspective. 99% of the time, be a layperson, not an astronomer. Engage with the comet when it comes around, not when it's out in the Oort cloud. Your overall system's rhythms of recurrence may be elaborate, but the rhythm of your work will be exactly what it needs to be. That's a little excerpt from the chapter on recurring tasks that resonates with this next idea of just simply focus on the components, not the whole. Think little. A lot of times we're told to think big, and there are times for thinking big. I say think little most of the time. Solve individual problems, and big problems tend to go away, or at least they become clearer and more solvable overall. If I recognize a gap in a workflow over here and I fix that, the consistency of that work will emanate out radiate out into other aspects of the work that I do. It will speed up other work. It will make things easier in other ways. And remember that you are the creator of the system, but you are also part of the system. Embrace your creator role from your part role. In other words, don't micromanage yourself. Take notes that surface in the right context, not notes that surface literally all the time and overwhelm your attention. And I see this a lot when I'm coaching people with their productivity. Because they're afraid things are going to disappear from their attention, they put everything in their attention, which does no good, because if everything's in your attention, nothing is. The physical manifestation of that is walking into the office of a client and seeing that they have 17 different pieces of paper laid out on their desk because they don't want to forget them. Well, by the time it's 17, they've forgotten them. You don't see them anymore when there's that many. In our digital space, this happens when we have our a daily agenda that has 72 items on it, and 62 of them are just things that we're hoping that we don't forget today. And they've just gradually piled up over time as we've moved them because they aren't really ready to be engaged with. We're just afraid of losing track of them. What we want to build and what the rhythms of productivity encourages is that we engage with things with the idea of how and when and in what context do we want them to resurface to our attention. And by so doing, we eliminate this, well, not entirely eliminate, but mostly eliminate the maintenance and overhead problem of keeping a system working, because we're not trying to keep it working by manipulating all the knobs and twisting all the dials. What we're doing is we're just engaging with the individual notes, the individual task, the individual recurring task, the templates, the procedures. We're engaging with them one by one when it's appropriate. And we can calibrate that. And so if something shows up and we're like, oh, I didn't need to see that yet, we can adjust it. That's the whole idea behind this approach. It's driven by action. And the system doesn't become overwhelming because it's the recurrence that improves that next action. Another layer. I've talked about both of these things are mechanical tactics, taking action, capturing recurrence, primarily driven by the tactical nature of these productivity bridges. How do we apply that to a bigger picture or a longer term? To do that, I use what I call roles, not goals, but roles. And I want to read an excerpt from the chapter Roles and Goals as a way of illustrating what I mean by roles and why I think they're more valuable than goals. Let me say before I read it that a role in the concept of the rhythms of productivity and my overall action-powered productivity approach is an identity that's tied to action within some aspect of your life and work. So I consider myself an engaged family man. That's a role, and there's action that's related to that role. There are projects, there's recurring tasks, there are other things that ensure that I play that role well. I consider myself a productivity thought leader and consultant. That's a role. The book is a primary example of a project in that role. By defining this action around my identities in my work and life, the roles, I can get a lot of value. Let's read this. Let's read this excerpt. Compared to their usefulness, goals have an outside place in most productivity discussions. People talk about goals because setting goals is easy. I can say I want to lose 60 pounds by summer with very little effort. But without the mechanics to achieve that goal, setting it is more likely to be frustrating than fruitful. Now, I mean no disrespect to my productivity colleagues who put goals first. The problem is that goals are misunderstood. The misunderstanding is similar to a common trope about how chess is played. Invariably, in a movie that involves chess, someone will spout off about a really smart person seeing 10 or more moves ahead. But here's the thing. Unless those are 10 forced moves, no one can see 10 moves ahead. That's not how chess works. Can a grandmaster understand the potential of a position better than I can? Yes, far, far, far better than I can. But unless my moves are required, usually the result of the king repeatedly being attacked, then it's not possible to see 10 moves ahead. Now, if I were playing a grandmaster, there probably aren't 10 moves left in the game anyway. Our standard understanding of goals pretends, like this chess trope, that we can see 10 moves ahead. And then when we don't achieve the goal or we achieve it partially in a way that we didn't intend, we feel like failures. We blame ourselves when most of the time it was the nature of the goal that is at fault. Aligning my action with the roles I play in my life and work is more valuable than setting a variety of goals. A role is an identity in your life or work that guides and directs your action and is adaptable to changing circumstances and priorities. If you base your action on those roles, those identities, you'll get clearer action than you do with goals. Here's why. First, roles are more stable than goals. If I define myself as an engaged family man, that role is going to persist beyond the next 6 months because I consider that role to extend to my sisters as well as my wife and children, and even beyond that, into a state of mind. Even in the face of tragedy, that role will persist. Goals are notoriously slippery, and beyond 6 months or so, they tend to drift. We can anchor them with action, as we'll discuss when we talk about roadmaps, but it's simpler for me to recognize the appropriate action when considering the roles I play than it is to generate action with a goal that I'm not even sure will be relevant in a few months. Two, roles are more flexible than goals. Now, hang on. Isn't this the opposite of roles are more stable that I just said? How can roles be more stable and more flexible? Because roles are better containers for action than goals are. Remember the container effect, and this is something I talk about in the bins and projects chapter. We discussed how the existence of a project both creates a space for capturing tasks and also reminds us that action is needed. Having the container helps me create more action toward the completion of that project. The same effect exists with roles. If I include productivity thought leader and consultant as a role, I create a container that can contain many projects directed toward that role, not just a linear string of projects pointed at one specific goal within that role. And simultaneously, the role of productivity thought leader and consultant, due to the container effect, reminds me to keep feeding that role with action. Goals, especially those of the vaunted SMART variety, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, tend to restrict more action than they facilitate. SMART goals sound great, but it's the action toward those goals that matters. Your projects are what should carry most of the weight of that specificity, measurability, and so forth. As we take action, other opportunities present themselves, and adherence to an overly specific goal can actually restrict us rather than enable us. If we allow goals to be flexible, though, in many ways they cease to be meaningful. A goal that I never intend to achieve won't be very motivating. That's why leading with roles prevents this problem. I get the best of both worlds, a clearly defined, specific understanding of a big picture category of my life, with the flexibility to direct various types of action toward fulfilling that role. And three, roles are easier to articulate than goals. It's relatively easy to pick roles that define the work I do and the life I lead. It's significantly more challenging to articulate one specific goal, particularly if it's SMART. If I define my roles, action becomes clearer. And I can set those smart parameters at the level of the project, usually, and sometimes with the roadmap coming up in the next chapter, which I'm not going to read here right now, but it's in the next chapter in the book. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit more what I mean about roles here. I suggest that you define roles through action. I talk about action powered. I talk about power action being first. Same entity here. We're going to define our roles through action. Roles without action are not really roles. I can say one of my roles is Olympic slalom skier, but with no action pointed in that direction, that's just a delusion. I'm not an Olympic slalom skier, and I have no action indicating that I'm intending to become an Olympic slalom skier. And I'm 44, so it's unlikely to happen at this point. I remember the time in my late 30s when I realized that becoming a Major League Baseball player was probably out of the question. I'd really given up that idea a long time, but there was a point where I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen now. It's okay, by the by, to have roles that you aspire to, but action still needs to take you toward that. If you have an action or a role rather that doesn't have any action in it, you're essentially deluding yourself, or you've got the container to encourage you to put more action there. Now, conversely, it's common to have action within roles that you would rather get rid of. There may be roles that I currently play that I don't really want to be playing, but there's action there, so they have to be accounted for. Take care of the action that's there, but be mindful that if you continue to feed that role with action, it will continue to exist. And so, if you are attempting to remove some particular role from your life, continuing to feed it with action will ensure that it continues to exist. You want to limit that as much as you can. When you first create roles, look at what you do and then categorize that action using roles. And then when you review roles, look at what you're doing and make sure that one, all the action that you have aligns with a role so that anything you're doing has some relationship to a role in your life, and either remove action or add roles as needed. And then on the other side, make sure that every role has some action associated with it. And based on that, either add action or remove roles as needed. If we think in terms of these roles, we define expectations. We talk the excerpt from the chapter is maybe a fifth of the chapter, maybe a little bit less. We talk about defining expectations. We talk about how roles can be just as valuable in helping you determine what not to do as what to do. We talk about how what the roles in my life are, or a subset of them, so as an illustration of how you can choose some of your own. And at the end of that chapter, just like every chapter in the book, we have what I'll talk about next, etudes. And I'll explain that in just a second. But if we have those roles defined, we're far more likely to be able to take action that aligns with what we truly identify as and what we want to be. And it's not some sort of magical thing that I'm talking about here. It's not just that. It's that I realize there are going to be things that we have to do that we don't necessarily want to. But as we understand the roles and we understand where they fit in our lives, we can, through determining where to put our action, have more control long term over where the meaningful and fulfilling work is in our lives, and de-emphasize and ultimately over time, maybe as much as possible, streamline or eliminate work that is not fulfilling or meaningful for us. Okay. One last thing before I talk just briefly about the process, and then we can get into the questions. Etudes. The idea of etudes here is that you do the work, the action-powered approach to learning an action-powered approach. Let me read a chapter excerpt here from the part of the last section of the beginning of the book, Your Rhythm, Your Flow, so that you know what on earth I'm talking about when I say etude. An etude is a musical composition designed to teach a specific skill. Unlike practicing scales, etudes give musicians something concrete to practice, a piece that can be performed once it is learned. In this book, each chapter of the theme and variation section will end with one or more etudes to develop your productivity skills. Over many years of teaching singers, I've worked with some students who never practiced between lessons. They made a little progress because our weekly lessons ensured that they at least understood key concepts, but they missed out on the real benefit, applying those concepts to develop their skills. Whenever I teach these would-be singers, I say to them, I like spending time with you, and I'm more than happy to continue taking your money to tell you the same things week after week. But you won't get the most out of our lessons unless you invest time practicing on your own. Don't be the student who doesn't practice. The etudes I provide are the most important part of the book. Yes, the concepts are important. Taking action and capturing recurrence are important, but they don't matter if you never master them as skills. Read the chapters, then do the etudes. It's a time investment. You'll spend time up front developing your skills, but you'll make that time back and more when you know how to use the system you build. This is a key part. I can't, I think, call my approach action-powered productivity unless I also give you some action to take to become more effective at the approach that we're taking. That's the goal of the etudes, to give you something concrete that not only helps you develop the skill, but when you're done, because of the way these etudes are built, also fills out an aspect of the system that you're building. So that, as you're developing, doing the etudes to develop the skill of finding the roles in your life, when you're done, you'll have the roles in your life that you can use in the system that you're building. And so it's not just marking time to learn skills, not that that would be marking time. It's important to learn skills, but it's also developing pieces and components of the system that you will put together. So it's not that those things that I've covered so far in the content are the only things covered in the book, but I think that's a nice overview of some of the key points: that action is first, that the system is developed by capturing recurrence in productivity bridges like templates and recurring tasks and procedures and automations, and that by looking bigger picture in roles rather than goals, we can better direct the action and the recurrence toward the things that are important to us. And then, of course, the etudes help us develop those skills. Let me briefly talk about the process of writing the rhythm of productivity, and then I'll move to some of the AMA questions, and I'll open it up for some of those of you who are able to attend live here, some of those questions. And I can see chats on YouTube, and so I see a couple comments there. If you have a question, you can also post them there. My eyes will bounce back and forth enough, I think, to catch all of it. But the process of writing the rhythms of productivity. First of all, I'm writing, and I'm what I'm calling pre-publishing in Tana. So I use Tana as my primary productivity driver. I don't require in the action-powered productivity approach or in the text of the rhythms of productivity, I don't require that people bring all of their hub of notes and tasks and whatever into one tool. As long as you have a seamless integration between tools, that's fine. For myself, I have my notes and I have my tasks living in Tana because that system works very nicely for me. And so by developing the text in Tana, where I have my notes, where I have the tasks pointing me to work on the text, I get a sort of maximum leverage out of being there. What really was the cincher for me, though, was a couple of months ago, Tana Publish, the feature Tana Publish came out, and that lets me actually put the text of the book out there. And that relates to number two here, my forcing function of running this as the content with cohort 11, the final cohort of my applied action powered productivity cohorts. So by making the text of the book the primary content of that cohort, I created a situation where I absolutely had to write the book, and I had to write it down. That was really valuable and a nice little lesson in accountability as a way of generating action, especially with something as large as writing a book. It was nice to have that. I say cohort 11. Note that there were 10 prior. That usually happens when you have number 11 of something. There were 10 prior, and a lot of the text and content that is in the book was developed. In fact, the bulk of it was developed over the course of those 10 cohorts of applied action powered productivity. And so the other thing about having a forcing function in cohort 11 is I wasn't starting from scratch. I had a lot of content that I was working with, and filling in the space. A lot of the stuff was video originally, and so getting that turned into prose, getting the finding analogies to sort of bridge some of the gaps within concepts and between concepts. That was a big part of what I've been doing here. But I wouldn't have done it if I didn't have people that I was writing for in the moment. Third thing, a part of the process, and I actually have a chapter on AI assist in the execution bridges section of the of the rhythms of productivity. But I use ChatGPT as an editor and to assist with creating definitions and etudes. So ultimately, I do the final work on what the text of the definition of one of my terms is and what the etudes are. But it was nice having an ability to, because creating the practice part, that's harder for me than creating the text of the book. And so I write the chapter and then I'd feed that chapter to ChatGPT and say, hey, what would be five exercises that would be valuable for someone trying to develop the skills I've talked about in this chapter? Then I take those five and boil it down to one or two, and I have the etudes that I'm going to use in the chapter. Same with definitions. I'm like, this is my what I say about roles. Give me a dictionary style definition of that. And then it's always 2 lines too long, and so I trim it up a little bit. But it gives me a way of sort of abstracting my own work as a first pass at some of these things. I encourage that. I haven't done the editing side of it much yet. I've occasionally asked it for some opinions about what could be tighter or what else, but I'm going to do more of that as I approach the next draft. But I think that everything I've done so far points to that being a valuable tool there. And 1 second, I see somebody's put something in the chat here. Okay, APP system. That's a great question. I'll answer that in a moment. Thank you, Penny. The using Adobe InDesign to lay out the paperback. Actually, at the end here of this little section, I'll talk to you. I'll give you a link to the PDF of the free preview that I'm calling. That's the first 29 pages, the introduction and overture of the book. Which I think gives a really good idea of what the rest of the text will be. But all of that is laid out in InDesign. My primary use of InDesign otherwise is making worship aids for the church where I work as the music director. And so I had to learn a few additional things. I rarely have drop caps, for instance, in the worship aids, but they look real nice in the text of the book, and that worked out well. I will be self-publishing using the Amazon Kindle Direct KDP thing here. I will update you on official launch date and final pricing as I have all that done. There will be an ebook version. There will be a paperback version as well. And so keep an eye on that. And with that in mind, there is a link here, rjn.st, the Rhythms of Productivity preview. I'll put it in the description of this video when we're done here. So rjn.st/the-rhythms-of-productivity-preview. And that will take you to a page where you can enter your email to be on the mailing list. I'll keep you updated. And it will also give you a link to the PDF of the free preview of the Rhythms of Productivity. So that's the sort of the step in the process now. I will probably edit those first sections a bit more, but I was pretty pleased with them as I was working back through and doing some initial editing the last few days here, getting them ready for that preview. So yeah, so that's the content of the book in brief, a sense of the process. And now I have some questions that were previously asked to me here. I'm actually going to stop the sharing of the screen here so I can just be on the screen rather than that. And I'll keep an eye over on the side here to read the questions here. And I had one question that popped in live here from Penny that I think is a good place to start. And although my chat thing here, where's my little chat thing? It's hiding in there. There we go. Penny asked me in the chat, how did the APP system support the writing of the book? So this is a fantastic question because obviously I very much practice what I preach. Something that's important to me when I am getting ready to do a cohort or creating one of my Tana for tasks, or another sneak peek here. Very, very soon I'll be releasing a thing called Tana for managers. But as I'm creating those things, is I have to use the system that I'm talking about and use it exhaustively. I need to know what's going to happen because I don't want to teach something to somebody else that I'm not confident that it will work in a lot of different environments and in a lot of different cases. So that's a big thing for me, is to make sure that that's the case. So it is absolutely true that I'm using my action-powered productivity approach as I'm writing the Rhythms of Productivity. So this action-first idea is very much a part of drafting an individual chapter. I mentioned that over the 10 cohorts of of applied action powered productivity, I developed the content. This is a really good illustration of the idea of capturing recurrence because as I teach a concept, I have it documented that I've done it. And each time I'm approaching it, it's getting refined, it's getting rethought. For cohort 10, I turned a lot of it into text, knowing that I would be, coming into writing a book in advance. So each step there, I'm capturing occurrence, but also transforming it with each subsequent review so that when I come to the place of the actual writing of the text, I can take action immediately. I can dive right into the writing of a chapter. I can take text that I have. I can bring it over. I can, dictate. One of the things I do a lot of is when I'm starting a text for something, I'll dictate it rather than typing it. And Tana in particular allows that very effectively. It's not that other tools don't allow it too, but Tana uses OpenAI's Whisper AI in the background, and it's the transcription is really, really accurate, which is a lot better than getting something that 95% accuracy is 1 in every 20 words is wrong. You don't want something of that. You don't want that necessarily. But when something's really accurate and you can rely on it, that makes that first step really easy. And so I will do a lot of dictation. And then I have, having taken that action, I now have all of these pieces. It's just a matter of bringing that together. The structure was also a matter of capturing a lot of recurrence and just reordering it because I have, so many cohorts of how did I present this information to people and in what order and how did that work. That largely became the layout for the book. I just sort of added an introduction to talk about how that was going to happen, and then some summaries at the end that take a few different angles on it to illuminate a few different points. But yeah, so hopefully that's a good answer. Any follow-ups on that, Penny? That makes sense?
Yeah, I just am fascinated by the process of actually writing a book and sort of how you get from an initial idea, and then because it is about a productivity system, right? Using that system to actually support the writing of the book. So no, I think that was really good. Thank you.
Well, and I'll mention, I think worth noting, the first cohort of what was then called AP Productivity began the first part of July of 2021. And so right now is the second last day of December in 2023. So that is almost exactly 2.5 years of content being developed, being honed, being refined. The trigger point though, and Brian is on this call here, was an email from Brian saying, "Hey, you need to use," and he didn't use in this terms, but you need to use your music background as a way into a lot of this. And it's funny because I use metaphors for that all over the place, but I hadn't really been thinking about, that as frame for the book. And that was the trigger. And everything flowed out of that because now I had an angle that made everything else stitchable. All of these things
Right.
that were sort of independent things, or they were in order, but they weren't necessarily threaded, became threadable because I had that an angle to take that was very familiar to me, with analogies ready made and some that there are a couple chapters in this book where I came into it, I'm like, what's the analogy? I'm like, oh, that's the analogy. And I would like literally it would come to me immediately because it's something I'm so both productivity and music are things I'm so familiar with now that the analogies between them were very straightforward to come across. So yeah. Ivy, I see you have a hand up. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, RJ, I was just gonna add, I love the music analogy and how you're using it as your angle in. And in your next book, when you talk about productivity for organizations, I just read an article where it talked about how the conductor of an orchestra doesn't go and play the instruments, just gets the people who do the job well and then leads them. And so I'm going to plant that seed for you. I love the whole musical thing, and you should write a book on productivity for organizations.
There it is. Good. Thank you, Ivy. And I will note just for everybody watching, I do not currently have on my slate productivity for organizations. So don't be watching for that one to come out immediately. I do think, and actually, I think one of the questions that may have been from you, Ivy, that I got here, I'm looking at here. Yeah, the work mostly focuses on personal productivity. How I mean, think of using something similar with teams of people, families, or work, or things like that. There are a couple of points that I think are really important around that. And one is, you're talking about the conductor doesn't need to do all the jobs. The conductor needs to be the person who coordinates all of those things. And that's very important. I think that's a critical point, and understanding that is a critical point. But a layer on top of that is the conductor. This is let me make an analogy here. I think I make this an analogy in the book. I'm pretty sure I make this analogy in the book. There, when you're singing, it is very easy, not you particularly, Ivy, but when people are singing, it is very easy to think about controlling the sound that's coming out and bouncing around in the hall. The thing is, there's only one time that you have any control over what that sound is, and that's while it's in your body. You can control it only, and control is not even a great word there. I don't like the word control, because generally speaking, trying to control leads to the opposite of control. We want to do the right kind of technical things that do control it, but not necessarily think I'm trying to control. But that aside, the only time I have any sway over what the sound will be is while it is still resonating in my body. It's the resonance created by my body, the sound vibrating and being amplified inside my body, that will determine how the room is impacted by that sound. And we have an awful lot of intention in our lives directed toward what we think other people need to be doing. And we don't really often pay attention on how does that impact what I need to be doing. And I think a big part of not Tana, excuse me, but productivity for leaders, I always said this because I was talking about Tana for managers a moment ago, but about productivity for leaders and managers is, yeah, you have to have your finger on the pulse of what other people are doing, but you have to do it from the perspective of, what does that mean my engagement with that needs to be? When do I need to leave them alone? When do I need to engage with them? When do I need to have structures lined up so that they will engage with me? When do I, and how do I do it in such a way that I optimize my role within the larger entity that I am trying to engage with? And so I think, while I do talk about personal productivity, and the scope of this book is essentially personal productivity, much more of that emanates outward into how do you work within an organization or with an organization than it may initially appear, because it largely is then a question of, how do I calibrate my inputs and outputs so that it works with what other people are doing, less than how. And I know you weren't saying this, Ivy, but this becomes often the intention of a lot of these ideas about leading people. It's not so much how do I control those people. It's a question of, how does what they need to do impact what I need to do, and what's the interface between that. And so if we have our personal productivity ironed out, and we understand, what's coming out and what's coming in and how to manage that, it makes it orders of magnitude simpler to determine, how do I then fit into into an organization? How do I fit as a leader in an organization? How do I fit as a collaborator in a space? Which is sort of an answer to the question, and sort of bouncing off what you were saying there. But I think an important note is that what we do personally has an enormous impact on what we do within an organizational space. And we can sometimes over think what we need to be doing to or for other people, from the standpoint of, how are we controlling sound that's now out of our body? We need to do it from the standpoint of, what is that impact on the role that we play? Hope that's some version of answer to, or commentary on what you said there.
Thank you. Very good. I like it.
Absolutely. One of the questions I had on Twitter was, were there any aspects of the writing process that surprised you? And not many. I have written a lot in my life, and not productivity books, but I've written a lot of scripts, and I've written, so I kind of had a flow to a process. But there was one that surprised me a little bit. I had so much content, put together from those cohorts. that I thought a lot of it would fit together more immediately than it did. There were a lot more, and not so much gaps in logic, but just sort of gaps in flow that I needed to fill with the analogies. And I think that was why the understanding that I needed to frame things around my musical background as a way in. That's why that was so valuable. And this is maybe something, maybe there's a larger lesson here for productivity in general. That what once I had the piece that filled the flow gaps, everything else started to take care of itself. But there were a lot more of those spaces, I think, both within topics, like talking about a daily agenda, gaps in flow between one idea and the next, and also between topics, like how an agenda and a log relate, and how can I, what do I need to talk about, and how do I illustrate that? So that was not surprising necessarily in process, but definitely surprising in the sense of there were aspects that were more that required a little bit more filling of that space, the analogy than I had expected. I can go back and forth if anybody has any questions in the room. I also have several in the space. I'll do one more here, but if you have questions, let me know. Somebody had emailed me, many people, and this might have been Ivy as well. Many people point out that the things they say no to have more to do with their productivity than the way they do certain tasks. Does the rhythm of productivity talk about this? I alluded to it a little bit a moment ago, that the layer I think that we get the most value for yes or no to certain work is the layer of roles. If I understand what my roles are and I understand my expectations for myself within those roles, it's easier for me to recognize work that I should be doing versus work that I shouldn't be doing. In the text, I use an illustration, an imaginary offer from a college in Nevada to be an instructor in music theory. And I go through my roles and, my engaged family man role, my productivity thought leader role, and ultimately my professional musician role, to determine that even within professional musician, I have no interest in working in an academic space. And so it's very easy for me to understand to say no to that, even though there are things alluring about it. I like music theory. I like, there's something about the stability of a college professorship that would be kind of nice. But I also know that there are other things that balance against it. And it's easier to say no to something that might otherwise be attractive if you have a clear understanding of what the roles are and how you play them. Now, I want to be clear, this is a process. You could determine that something comes along and you're like, hey, you know what? That does fit with something that I'm interested in, but I haven't necessarily accounted for with one of my roles. You may find that you want to develop, a new area of your life, a new thing that you're opening up, a new identity that you play. So it's not just a cut and dried, if it doesn't fit, no. Gives you a way to converse with your system about whether or not something is going to be well suited. Yes, go ahead, Brian.
So I think that most people who would be potentially interested in your book have already read Getting Things Done. So how about describing why it's worth their while to read your book as opposed to just going back and rereading GTD?
Absolutely. Well, first, let me say, and I say this in the very first part of the book, if you get the free preview, you'll see it. Although what I do now diverges from David Allen and GTD, I very much owe a debt of gratitude. That was the book that I read that moved me in my productivity journey. That was also, the bones of it live somewhat in what I'm doing. Certainly, if I hadn't read GTD, I wouldn't have written The Rhythms of Productivity. However, several things that I found over the years have moved me to diverge from David Allen. And the most important and the most critical is the idea of recurrence itself. GTD doesn't really talk about recurrence at all. It's implicit in the idea of a weekly review and in the idea of emptying your daily inbox. But I want to point out, for those who do know GTD, where are the two pieces in your system that have the most failure points? They're the weekly reviews and the daily inbox. That's where the failure points are. And it happens because things are getting piled up in ways that you don't have the mechanics through other kinds of recurrence and other rhythms of recurrence. You don't have the mechanics to get those things spread out. I know that some people like a grouped weekly review, but most people have a problem with the weekly review because there are too many things in it. And not all of those things are related to one another. This is because recurrence is not independently addressed in GTD. It's just all, if something needs to recur, well, let's do it in the weekly review. I'm making a little bit of a straw man here, but for you get the idea. The problem with that is we wind up not doing the review because it's such a hassle to do. There's so many things that make that work. In my own approach, now I want to be clear that I talk about this in the rhythms of productivity quite a bit and give a few examples from my own life. I'm not saying you have to do everything exactly the way I do it, but as an example from my own system. One of the things in the weekly review is reviewing all your projects. Well, that's one of the things that holds people up because a lot of people have a lot of projects. I don't do that. I have a separate mechanism for reviewing projects. And this is a great example. I read that chapter, that excerpt on the recurring tasks and how if you think about this from the system level, it can be scary, but on the individual level, it's not. Every single project I have has its own period for review based on the number of days when I want to see it again. And projects that are active right now, that I'm doing right now, those likely have small numbers, like I want to see it every day or every 2 days or every 4 days or whatever. Projects that, are longer term or that they're not as immediately important may have more like 13 days or 21 days or, 36 days or something like that. That again, if you looked at it from the project level, that would be like, why am I doing all of these, all these things? I don't. I review them every day, and only the ones that are showing up on that given day show up to my attention. And so I'm actually reviewing projects now on cycles that are related to the actual work of the project rather than arbitrarily at the weekly level. By so doing, I see them more often. I see them when I need to see them, and I don't waste a lot of time looking at them because they're just there. It's more of a fail-safe than anything else. If a project is immediately in front of me, I probably already have tasks that are in that, and I know exactly what I'm doing with them. My project review on a daily basis generally has 4 to 5 projects that show up based on their own independent cycles, and it generally takes me about 30 seconds to do that review. And so that's, multiply that by 7 for the week, and that's, 210 seconds, so 3 minutes and a half that over the course of a week. I bet you that there aren't very many people doing their weekly review on their projects. They're executing that in 3.5 minutes on the week. And all of it's because those projects now sit in a rhythm of review that is related to the project and not to an arbitrary state like is in GTD of let's just look at them every single week. And so that's something that that is, a difference with what I do in APP versus GTD. Another aspect is I mentioned the inbox as another point of failure. It's not that you can't have a place in your system where miscellaneous things go. You can, but I hardly ever need something like that. You heard me obliquely mention bins when I was reading one chapter, bins and projects. Projects are what you think they are. They're containers for tasks that are related by a common outcome or a common purpose, as well as hubs for information related to executing those tasks. Bins are containers for tasks that are related by category. Things like home and auto, or my church work, or music work, or things that are sort of like what in GTD might have been called a context, but wasn't used in this way in GTD. So you can, a container for those tasks would be a bin. Because I've defined those kinds of bins for those tasks, I now almost never need an inbox because I don't have to. The problem with an inbox is it forces you to touch everything twice. You think of it, you put it in the inbox, and then later you have to process it from the inbox and put it somewhere else. If I have a system that is fine-tuned to the work that I do, and I have bins for these various categories of things in my life, it's going to be rare that I don't immediately know where something needs to go when I encounter it. And so if I have structures for notes, and I have structures for tasks, and I have structures that capture future events, and I have places to put them like bins and projects, and I know what those are, now mechanically speaking, I'm not in a position where I have to use an inbox very often. And thus it's not going to pile up and become that place of death and decay that it becomes, that people don't want to visit it because there's stuff in there that's been in there for weeks and they know they're supposed to be having redone it, emptied it out daily. It's kind of like a pile of papers or something that builds up on your desk. and it gets bigger and bigger, and it gets more and more daunting. And then you finally deal with it. You realize that only about 5 papers even mattered, and the rest of it was garbage. That's what your inbox can become if you aren't, if you aren't using a system like APP that helps you put the things that don't need a bypass step, don't need an extra step of your processing, put them directly where they need to be. That's 2 components. I think there are probably other layers because I talk about using an agenda for planning your day. That isn't something that's talked about much at all in GTD. GTD relies on, once you have all your next actions set up, you rely on your mind like water, which I say is for most of us mind like molasses. And so I rather have a little bit of a plan set aside for my agenda, and that's another piece. But that's a great question, because I think that although I have roots in GTD and I've used GTD, there are a lot of what I do is kind of here's a music analogy. Richard Wagner, a composer in the middle of the 19th century, a famous operatic composer, was very influential on other composers. And the music of my favorite composer, Gustav Mahler, drew a lot from Wagner initially, and as he developed his voice. And Claude Debussy, which couldn't sound different from Wagner, was also very heavily influenced by Wagner, but he made a conscious choice early in his writing to essentially do the opposite, flip around and say, this is what Wagner did, and this is what I'm going to do. That is, a very stark contrast to that. So that's 2 different ways of using influences, and some of the things that I have in my system are influenced in the Mahler way, and some of them are influenced in the Debussy way. In that I think this is a good idea, I'm going to keep it, or this doesn't work, I'm going to replace it with something that does. That's sort of where APP comes with that. And actually, I see a question on YouTube here. How can we deal with sequential tasks in APP? So this is something that comes up a lot. The answer may be satisfactory and maybe not. And that is this: I don't use sequential tasks. The mechanics that I have in my project reviews and the way that I handle tasks means that, one, I just described that mechanics for my project reviews. If I see a project comes up in a review and I don't know what's next on that project, I go into the project and I look and see where the tasks are, and I schedule a task. Tasks for me are scheduled. If a task isn't, and this is in the book, if it isn't scheduled, then it's not a task. Simple as that. I haven't committed to doing it. It's not a task. I have something I call prototasks, which are things that look like tasks, but they aren't scheduled. And so the closest thing to answer the question, the closest thing to sequential is what I call prototasks. And those are those things that I review, but I don't review them daily. I have them, I think the most recently created prototask I review like every 4 days or so. And then as they cycle out and they've been older than 30 days, I review them maybe every 7 or 8 days or so that I don't lose touch with them until eventually, maybe a couple 100 days later, they fall off the end of the system. If I've been reviewing them repeatedly for 200 days and I haven't done them, they need to fall off the back end of the system. But so it's not something that I deal with a whole lot. Now, I will say one layer of that is important to consider. And I see your hand, Brown. I'll be within a second. And that is, I do have something I call a date-driven project template. And so the idea there is, this is a huge part of capturing recurrence. I have taken action on something. I've done a project once. I look at it. I say, what did I do in that project? What were the actions I took? I capture that recurrence in a date-driven project template. So the next time I do that, the sequential tasks are all scheduled sequentially. So the way I handle the sequential tasks then is they're scheduled sequentially. They're not something that I have to go into the project to find that task. They surface to me because they're scheduled for a certain day and they'll arise. I can reschedule them. I have within my projects. Now I'm talking Tana here, sort of. This is not necessarily rhythms of productivity requirement, but I have a calendar view and I can move them around if I need to. But that's the way that I handle sequential tasks, is that when it's something that recurs, they're scheduled. It's something I'm doing for the first time. I'm just reviewing the project and creating the tasks that I do schedule as I do that. So hopefully that's a good answer for you. I should have said the second part first, but that's the thing with answering a thing on the fly, is it didn't necessarily occur to me to say the second part till I'd said the first part. But sequentially, I handle it by scheduling. And if I don't have, if they aren't ready to be scheduled, they're prototasks that I review in a separate function. Go ahead, Brian.
So I think your answer about the difference between GTD and APP left a few things out. And I think that the
Okay.
things that you left out are really critical and are worth the price of the book. So I would include in that the idea of bridges, totally
Sure.
absent in GTD and critical to APP. Automation. You mentioned recurrence in terms of reviews, but both you and I use a ton of recurring actions that have nothing to do with reviews. They're just the things that we do every day, every week, every month. And that mechanism is completely lacking in GTD and is fundamental to APP. The other thing that GTD emphasizes and uses almost exclusively, as far as I can tell, is the idea of projects and and projects that have a next action. And you have extended the project concept considerably and avoid the use of next action. So all of those, I think, are really the reason why I think that people who are interested in GTD would be interested in APP.
I love that. And let me say, first of all, I've been doing the cohorts for 2.5 years, but I've been corresponding with Brian for 3 years. And so it's really good to have someone like Brian around who has a list of things that I didn't think of in the moment. I said recurrence, and in my head, that means all the various things, but you're absolutely right. The specification of the recurring task, the specification of the templates and the project driven templates and the or date driven templates, how projects are different. I think I appreciate that is a deeper clarity and understanding of
Hey,
how they're
hey,
different.
RJ, can I
Yeah,
add
go ahead,
one
Ivy.
last bit of
Yeah, of
flavor
course.
to that?
Yeah.
Which is that when David Allen wrote Getting Things Done, the level of automations that were available and the level of software tools that were available were nothing like they are today. And one of the things that I think you've done brilliantly is by defining the approach, but leaving room for the evolution of the tools and the ecosystem. And so I love how you automate various things. Both you and Brian are really, really good at that. And it will be the case that a year from now, if we're having this conversation, there are very likely tools and techniques that we're using that align with your thinking and your writing on this that don't exist today.
I
And so it's just
appreciate
an
that.
important
Yeah.
point.
I think that, and it's something that I've said in a couple different places, and I'm sure I have somewhere in the book. There comes a point at about, I've written about 75,000 words there. There comes a point around 35,000 words where you don't remember what you've written, and so you have to until you go back and review again. But somewhere in there, I talk about the idea that capturing recurrence is a timeless skill. Much in the same way learning to type, though that may be with dictation becoming less timeless now, but has been a timeless skill in the sense that you can getting that skill better improves a lot of other things that you're doing. Capturing recurrence is an example of that kind of skill. It's not really tied to a particular tool, but it is tied to the sort of modern ability to automate, this modern ability to have recurring tasks. Not that recurring tasks didn't exist in David Allen times, but it's much simpler in a lot of tools now. You can do all of that in a way that now that these kinds of things, I talk about automation. This was the purview of large organizations before. Now we all have tools that we can all use that can give us the same kind of power. And so I think that, and I appreciate what you said, that I think that what we talk about in the book isn't tied to any particular one way of doing it, but to the concept of how you can do it. And then once you implement it, you understand how to do that, and it makes it easier over time. It's great. I'll read a couple more questions here. I'm a little over the time I said, but I'm having a good time, so it's good. One question here, I maybe have answered this mostly, but I'll do it anyway because it bears repeating. Books dealing with productivity usually don't include practice sessions. Why are etudes part of this book? So I read the excerpt on etudes. The piece that we have a tendency, take care, Ivy. The piece that we have a tendency to undervalue is the actual development of skills. Now, we think we value it, but we don't. We spend a lot of time reading, about things. We spend a lot of time, researching things, and all of that's great. I'm not saying that's not important. That's not a step one of developing a skill, but the core step is doing the thing, practicing the thing. And note the word practice. I can use it in a music setup, like I'm talking about. I go and I practice piano. That means I rehearse the skill at playing the piano. I can also practice law, which just means, well, I need a license. But get the idea. Practice in that sense just means do it. It doesn't mean rehearse it. It means do it. And that's what practice is. It's doing. And in this act of doing, this iterative act of doing, get better. So we talk about, I talk about, and I in the book I make this distinction. When we talk about capturing recurrence, there's really two different kinds of recurrence. There's the recurrence that we're capturing that allows us to do the same work repeatedly in a consistent way. Take care, Kara. And then we also have the kind of recurrence that's iteration, the kind that's recurrence directed at improvement. And that's what these etudes are all about. You do that work so that you can develop the skill. And then, of course, as I say, they're etudes, which means that you can use them after you're done with them. It's not just practicing your scales. No one wants to listen to somebody practice their scales. Not that it isn't important, but no one wants to listen to it. The etudes have value when you're done. So that's the goal, is to give you something practical that nonetheless will also develop the skills that you need to be more effective at using the system that you develop based on the rhythms of productivity. And I'll answer one more question here, because I think this was an important one, maybe less so to just people reading the book, but I think it's an important consideration. And that is, I mentioned earlier, cohort 11, the final cohort. The question is, if there are no more cohorts, how will you help people implement action-powered productivity in the future? Well, there won't be any more cohorts because of the structure now of having the book as a core resource. And let me explain what I mean by that. In cohorts 1 through 11 of applied APP, I always was doing this balancing act, where on one hand, we're talking about the APP system, which is tool independent. And then on the other, we're trying to talk about implementing it in different kinds of tools. And it's this sort of balancing act that was never fully desirable. It's not exactly where I wanted to be, but necessary, because we had to both learn the concepts and develop the implementation. Now that I will have the book, and the book will do the job of presenting the concepts, what I'm going to do now are not sort of all-inclusive, all-encompassing cohorts, but rather group sprints that are built around a certain tool, that are the implementation of APP in particular tools. Because I use Tana, that will be first. I'll probably have one starting up by the beginning of February. I haven't laid out the exact plan yet. It will be very similar to the structure overall of what we would have done in a cohort, but it's going to be a little shorter, and it's going to be much more tightly focused on the implementation of things in Tana. And so it's not, the concept's not going away. But the way of executing it is going to be different. The book then gives us the frame, all the concepts, the reference point for things. I can point to the book. I can say, read this chapter. I can do that. But then I can direct those things to a particular tool of Tana. I just had a question pop through in the chat on YouTube that says, will you do Rome again? I have a great deal of love for Rome research. Rome research, in the same way that reading GTD in 2014 changed my life, discovering Rome research in a Notion subreddit, sorry, Notion, in March of 2020 changed my life. I didn't know that tools like that existed, and being able to develop my productivity approach in Rome was incredible. It changed both the way that I work, and also gave me another tool that I could help others work more effectively. September last year, I moved from Rome to Tana. And I did that because Tana has a similar, input layer in terms of it's still an outliner. But it addresses a couple things that were problems for me in Rome. One is I don't, and this is me personally, by the by. So we're talking about RJ's thinking about why he uses Tana versus Rome, not necessarily anybody else's. I was always bugged by the fact that Rome had pages and blocks, and pages were functionally blocks, but they just had a few additional priorities. Whereas Tana is essentially all blocks. The term is node in Tana, but it's essentially all blocks. I like that because then I can choose which of those nodes more fluidly become relevant in particular ways. And the second reason I moved to Tana is related to that relevance, and that's the ability to create structures, objects of information, what they call super tags, on any given node. So I can create, a project anywhere in my workspace, and I know it'll show up via search where I need it, when I need it, in the context in which I need it. That's harder to do in Rome. Structure is harder to build in Rome, and I was able to imitate some of that with extensions like the smart blocks and so forth. Which big shout out to TFT Hacker and and then David Vargas, who took that extension and made it what it was. But so the answer is, will I do Rome again? No, probably not. However, I would be surprised if sometime down the road I don't team up with somebody who does actively do Rome, and I have enough, core knowledge of Rome still, that I will probably do a Rome sprint of how do you implement action-powered productivity in Rome. So I can't promise that, but given that I intend to expand into other tools with the implementations, I would be surprised if Rome wasn't one of those tools. I say I would be surprised as though, but this is the magic, you see, of thinking in roles instead of goals. I'll be surprised myself. It all fits in the role. I know that there's the action there, that's potential for that action, but I don't know yet whether that's going to be something that's going to be of interest or value to me at the time. But I suspect that it likely will. Same with Obsidian. I am not an Obsidian user and haven't. Well, I've used it, but never with any great proficiency. But I have many friends who do, and so those many friends who do may help me organize what a sprint could look like in Obsidian for learning applying the rhythms of productivity skills and action powered productivity in that. So yeah. Well, this has been really fun for me. Hopefully, it's been of value to you all as well. I'll bring back up here real quick the link to the free preview of, this is it down here, rjn.st/the-rhythms- of-productivity-preview. That will take you to allow you to put in your email so that you can get updates, and also that will give you the free preview PDF. If it doesn't work for some reason, I think most of you probably have my email address. If you can email me and I can send it to you, no problem. But hopefully this has been useful. I'm really looking forward to continuing getting this text completed. A lot of joy has come through, a lot of work, but a lot of joy has come through this process as well as I've done this here. Cool. Thank you all for attending live. Thank you to all of you, and those of you who are watching on YouTube. Thank you. The last time I ended one of these things, I fished for several minutes trying to find the right button. So hopefully I'll hit the right button the first time today. All right. Thank you all, and take care.
Thank you, RJ.
Bye.